You know, many Canadians are still talking about Queen Elizabeth II and how her death impacted so many. Premier Jason Kenney was an admirer of the Queen and was expected to address the Legislature this week on her death and the accession of King Charles III. To discuss this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us from Edmonton. Tyler, Queen Elizabeth was last in Alberta, I believe, in 2005, visiting Jasper. She appeared to have a very strong and close connection with so many Canadians.
She did, yeah. I think of my late grandmother and the admiration that she had for the Queen. I think there's very much a certain generation of Canadians that feel, this really, really close connection with the monarchy. And of course, the funeral is coming up on Monday, so eyes will be glued to that, I'm sure. I believe the Prime Minister is traveling. Probably worth noting that I don't think any of the provincial premiers are going, which of course would include Jason Kenney. Logistically speaking, that would simply not really be possible, I think. So there is that. But there's going to be a few impacts on the way our province operates. This isn't a huge political story, but it is worth keeping note of. People might be reading a news story and hear about the Court of King's Bench, for example, and think, well, what the heck is that? But of course, it was formerly the Court of Queen's Bench, and now that there's a king, that needs to change. So there's going to be some of these sort of small changes that we see in our daily lives. Funnily enough, I was wondering about this myself and took a look at the memorial page that the government of Alberta has on their website, and the QE2 highway will not be changing its name. So, that does not change, I guess, with the change in the monarch.
Yeah, and out in Southern Ontario, it's the QEW as well. I've driven that and been stuck on that for many hours and many times. Tyler, we're just a few weeks away from finding out who the new premier will be here in Alberta. The UCP will be choosing its new leader on October the 6th. Would it be safe to say that the two frontrunners right now are Travis Toews and Danielle Smith?
I think that would be accurate. It's, as I think we've talked about before, it's a little bit tough to say, and preferential sort of balloting system, you never really know where the cards could fall. But certainly a lot of the chatter has been about Danielle Smith and Travis Toews. A lot of the news coverage has been about the two of them. When we talk about big policy proposals, they seem to be the ones who people are, sort of jumping to talk about first. So I certainly think that would be the case. But a few weeks is a lifetime in politics. I mean, who knows what could happen in the intervening weeks? But I think that's very much safe to say. And Danielle Smith, for example, really drove the conversation for the first couple months of this leadership race. And some of the others are sort of trying to shoehorn their way in here and there. But I think it's pretty clear to say that they are the two front runners, and Brian Jean possibly also in that mix. It's a little bit hard to predict what the order of those three might be.
Could we potentially see any of the other candidates bowing out and maybe throwing their support behind either Smith or Toews?
It's a good question, and we haven't seen that yet, which is kind of interesting. For example, not to disparage Todd Loewen, but Todd Loewen is running sort of a similar campaign to Danielle Smith, and is proposing some of the same things, is sort of the same libertarian bent. So you could see him, for example, bowing out and endorsing Danielle Smith. You could see some of the former people who were formerly cabinet ministers with Travis Toews, Rajan Sawhney or Rebecca Schultz. Perhaps they bow out and endorse him to try and give him a little bit of a boost. You could see it happen. I haven't heard any word of it, but if with the news cycle where it is, I mean, I could look like a fool by the time people are listening to me say this.
Yeah, news is always changing, absolutely,
Exactly.
Tyler. Now, a new Legislature poll is out, which asked Albertans, if an election was held right now, today, who would you vote for? And the winner would be?
It would be the UCP. Pretty narrow victory, sort of 40 to 44, I think, or 40 to 38% kind of vote split in there. It would be a narrow victory, which of course is a big change from what we were looking at a year ago or 8 months ago or a year and a half ago, that showed that the NDP was doing really, really quite well. The UCP sort of got this bump in the polls when it was announced that Jason Kenney was going to be resigning back in May, and that only sort of seems to have continued through the summer. Couple explanations for this, of course. The pandemic measures being lifted certainly has made a lot of people a lot happier, and the really good economic news, frankly, the $13 billion surplus that was announced the other week. Those are things that are only going to be good for an incumbent government. But you look at that polling, and then in a few weeks' time we're going to have a new premier. So hard to say where that polling might go with Danielle Smith in the premier's chair, or Travis Toews, or Brian Jean, or Leela here. You never really know.
And how that premier is going to resonate with a lot of Albertans. depending upon what side of the fence you stand right now. Now, the UCP leadership hopefuls are now discussing another major reform, and that is overhauling Alberta's health services. Danielle Smith says she wants to fire the AHS board and decentralize control of the province's healthcare system.
Yeah, and I believe that's echoed by Travis Taves as well, who's talked about giving, I think, $50 million to sort of rural medical centers and reforming some of the billing for people in more remote areas. Brian Jean has talked about changing the role of the chief medical officer of health to make it sort of less powerful, I think, more accountable. So this is a topic of conversation very much at the moment, and it's kind of interesting, I would say, because we've sort of been through this before, right? We've gone through a decentralization and a re-centralization, for example, of AHS. They talk about what to do about rural healthcare and rural medicine has been going on for a considerable amount of time. The question I think that is going to become one for voters in the year ahead, is to what extent is there meat on the bones of these promises? How much are these things actually resonating with people? But it is interesting, a little bit of a new front in things we're talking about here, not just the autonomy question. And some experts pointing out in news stories this week that, sort of caught my eye, that there's been quite a bit of talk, when I mentioned the chief medical officer of health thing, the accountability stuff, there's a lot of discussion about COVID and the pandemic and sort of the power of public health, and a little bit less conversation, I think would be fair to say, about some of the nuts and bolts issues. How are you going to get more doctors to Grand Prairie or Peace River or Beaver Lodge or something like that? So it'll be interesting to see how that conversation evolves in the weeks ahead.
Tyler, the National Police Federation, the RCMP union, is pushing to keep the RCMP right here in Alberta. No provincial police force, but the RCMP. And it's an idea that's apparently resonating with some of the UCP leadership hopefuls.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. We've talked about it before, that the Kenney government has sort of been studying this and pushing this, and it hasn't resulted in a clean break with some of the leadership hopefuls. Danielle Smith is in favor of it. Travis Taves is in favor of it. Brian Jean is sort of in favor of it. Some of the other candidates are not. But it is being picked up and discussed. So what this sort of sets up is a little bit of a confrontation should one of these pro-Alberta provincial police force candidates become the premier. Because the National Police Federation has, I believe it's 92 signatories now of this sort of call to action, open letter kind of thing, saying to keep the RCMP in Alberta. And many of them are sort of small town municipalities and rural areas. That are currently served by the RCMP. And even if they are the ones feeling some of the issues with response time and rural crime and things like that, they are leery of bringing in a new provincial police force. So obviously this is a sort of change that wouldn't greatly affect Edmonton and Calgary, which have their own police forces, Lethbridge as well, Medicine Hat. So it's really interesting that you see this government studying this and talking about this thing that doesn't seem to be that popular, and you have these leadership candidates sort of doing the same thing. So it's going to set up a really interesting political dynamic when a new premier comes in, if that promise is sort of kept in the bag or becomes an election issue in several months' time.
Justice Minister Tyler Shandro has asked the head of the Alberta Human Rights Commission to step down. Colin May has only been in the role for a couple of months now, Tyler, but has been dogged by some controversy.
Yes. So back in 2009, he wrote a book review of a book called Islamic Imperialism, written by, I believe, an Israeli academic. And in it sort of endorsed the views of the book to some extent, and had sort of used terms that critics have now said are Islamophobic. And so this sort of controversy came out a month or two ago now, and he's sort of been, as you said, dogged by these controversies. And he had, according to news reports this week, had agreed to sit down with some Muslim organizations to learn more about the faith and things like that. It now appears that those meetings haven't happened. And, it's a little bit hard to say what's gone on behind the closed doors in conversations between Tyler Shandro and Colin May, but it did sort of culminate this week in a request that he resign. So just, a little bit of summer drama there for the Alberta Human Rights Commission, I would say.
Lethbridge West MLA and my MLA, Shanna Phillips, announced that she will be running again here in the Windy City. But a couple of other prominent MLAs will not be returning to the Ledge, including Doug Schweitzer and Darren Billis. Tyler, how will this really impact the UCP as we move forward to the next year's provincial election?
Well, it's a bit tricky to say, but, I always think it's worthwhile keeping an eye on who is moving where, who's sticking around, because it does perhaps tell us a little bit about where they think the party is going. Doug Schweitzer, fairly middle of the road conservative here, just recently got a job with, I think, Denton's actually, moving on to the private sector. So what are the reasons why he left? Maybe was he uncomfortable about where the party might go? This is sort of the speculation that reporters and pundits like to do when they look at these things. But Darren Billis leaving, for example, is if the NDP wins the next government, he was a minister in Rachel Notley's cabinet. Who's going to fill those shoes? So it does provide a little bit of sort of fun speculation, let's say, about what a party might do in power, where that party might be going. And I mean, it's no surprise, I don't think, that Shannon Phillips is going to run again, relatively prominent member of Rachel Notley's team. And that sort of thing. But there's going to be more of this, I guess, is the point. As we come up on the election, there's going to be more people who are running again. There's probably going to be some controversy with candidates trying to shoehorn their way in or trying to oust current candidates in nomination battles, or current MLAs in nomination battles, I should say. So it's worth keeping an eye on, even if it's not, explosively sort of front page news.
I put up my feelers here in Lethbridge about potential star candidates to run up against Shannon Phillips for the next provincial election, representing the UCP for Lethbridge West, but I've come up empty so far. Have you heard anything where you are?
There hasn't been a whole lot of chatter that I've heard about who some of these star candidates might be. And, you have to think that both sides are looking for some of these people. And you also have to think that anyone who is considering being a star candidate, especially for the UCP, is maybe waiting to see where the leadership sort of falls.
Right.
You might, if you're a prominent, Travis Taves supporter or something like that, you're probably not going to want to run under Danielle Smith's leadership and vice versa. So we might see a little bit more of that in sort of the weeks and months ahead here.
We've chatted with Drew Barnes a number of times on our show on Bridge City News, the MLA, independent MLA from Cypress Medicine Hat, and asked him specifically, would you be interested in rejoining the caucus with the UCP, depending upon the new leader? And he was open to the idea. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting because that actually came up in the final UCP leadership debate a couple of weeks ago. And for the life of me, I can't remember who exactly said it, but there was some discussion, some call to allow these MLAs to sort of rejoin the UCP caucus. So we'd have Drew Barnes and Todd Lowen as well. And Pat Wren had been kicked out, but I think he'd been let back in. So I believe it's maybe just the two of them at the moment. And so there was a call to sort of commit to letting these people back into caucus. So I think it's probably safe to assume that that this will happen, depending, of course, on who becomes leader. Maybe not Travis Taves, since he was part of the Kenney cabinet at the time, but I believe Brian Jean and Danielle Smith, I think, both committed to that. So I think it's entirely possible that we will see that happen.
And as a candidate too, I think it gives you a lot more clout if you have a party backing you heading into the next provincial election instead of just being an independent. Now, Tyler, normally you and I talk mainly about provincial stories, but let's chit-chat a bit about Pierre Poilievre, crowned the new leader of the CPC, and the potential autonomy if he became Prime Minister, and if the UCP remains in power here in Alberta next year. That could potentially be good in Alberta, particularly for our energy and agriculture sectors.
Yeah, and the thing that is sort of on my mind in terms of Alberta-Ottawa relations, I guess you could say, is to what extent does this autonomy stuff survive if a Trudeau isn't the prime minister? And actually, I put the question to Brian Jean after the leadership debate. I said, look, you've talked about reopening the Constitution, renegotiating equalization, those sorts of things. Does this promise still stand if it's Prime Minister Pierre Poilievre in a couple years? And he said it does. He said that this needs to be done regardless of who is in power. So I thought that was quite interesting. The other thing you have to wonder is if that causes some problems for Pierre Poilievre federally. Do the federal Liberals say, this Alberta sort of conservative sovereignty movement, is Pierre endorsing this, blah, blah, blah. It maybe opens up a line of attack on him. So I think I'm going to be keeping quite a close eye on that, because there's the grassroots sort of alienation that is in a not inconsequential part, I think, because of Justin Trudeau being prime minister. And does that change if he is no longer prime minister? And for the political side of it, the politicians in the legislature, are they still able to gin up as much support if Justin Trudeau isn't in the prime minister's office? So there's some interesting dynamics there, I think, that I'm going to be keeping an eye on for sure, because I think it's just a fascinating state of affairs. And I know I'm rambling on here, but of course, Pierre Poilievre didn't endorse or hasn't endorsed anyone in the leadership race. So he's actually kind of been staying out of it, which is just sort of a notable point so far.
It's interesting too, let's say if Trudeau were to step down and let's say Francois Philippe Champagne were to take over as Liberal leader and then Prime Minister. And he's very much pro-trade and pro-business, so that might help Alberta as well. So remains to see what's going to happen. It should be very interesting.
And who knows? It could be Chrystia Freeland, raised in the same area as Rachel Notley and, funnily enough, Jordan Peterson. So who knows?
He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Thanks for joining us today from Edmonton.
Always a pleasure, Hal.